One waterway, 33 miles wide, closed. And right now, the countries that depend on it are spending an estimated $49 million every single week, building, scrambling, and engineering their way around it. This is the plan. And most people have never heard about it. Here's what $49 million a week actually looks like on the ground. Convoys of tanker trucks rolling through the Jordanian desert, hauling crude oil by road because there's no pipeline yet. Emergency crews in hard hats doing around-the-clock hydrostatic testing on a 960-kilometer pipeline that hasn't moved a single barrel of oil since 2014. Port facilities in Turkey, Jordan, and Syria being activated simultaneously, loaded with equipment, personnel, and infrastructure that hadn't been touched in years. And in Baghdad, government officials signing emergency tenders, negotiating across 3 international borders at once, while a Hong Kong investment firm submits a multi-billion-dollar pipeline proposal to Iraq's oil ministry. All of this, every week, because the Strait of Hormuz has effectively closed. And here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. The $49 million per week that Iraq alone is spending right now. That's the emergency cost of having no backup plan when the world's most critical energy choke point shuts down. Compare that to the countries that did have a plan. Saudi Arabia spent $2.5 billion, about $8.5 billion in today's money, building a 1,200-kilometer pipeline across the Arabian Peninsula back in 1981. That pipeline sat mostly idle for 44 years. Then, the moment the strait closed, it became the single most important piece of oil infrastructure on the planet, activated within hours, running at full capacity within days, not weeks. Days. The UAE spent $4.2 billion building a separate pipeline to a port on the Indian Ocean side of the peninsula, also mostly idle, also activated immediately. 2 countries that planned ahead versus a region full of countries that didn't. And right now, the entire global energy market is living with the consequences of that difference. That is the story this video is going to tell you. Not just what's happening at the Strait of Hormuz, but the engineering decisions made decades ago that are now determining who can keep the oil flowing and who can't. To understand Saudi Arabia's $8.5 billion gamble, you need to go back to 1979. The Iranian Revolution has just toppled the Shah. The Soviet Union has invaded Afghanistan. And in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia's strategic planners are staring at a map and asking one question: what happens if someone closes the Strait of Hormuz? Their answer was not diplomatic. It was engineering. King Khalid authorized construction of a pipeline in 1979. 2 years later, in 1981, it was complete. What they built was audacious. A twin pipe system, one pipe measuring 48 inches in diameter, the other 56 inches, stretching 1,200 kilometers straight across the Arabian Peninsula. From the Abqaiq oil processing complex in Saudi Arabia's eastern province, through the scorching Dana sand desert, over the Hejaz mountain range, all the way to the Red Sea port of Yanbu on the country's western coast. The Petroline, also known as the East-West Pipeline, built not because Saudi Arabia needed it at the time, but because Saudi Arabia understood it might need it later. For 44 years, it ran well below capacity. Quiet, partially used, mostly forgotten. Most energy analysts rarely mentioned it. Most news coverage never touched it. Then, the Strait of Hormuz closed. Within hours, Saudi Aramco activated its contingency protocol. Within days, Aramco CEO Amin Nasser announced, on the company's earnings call of all places, that the Petroline would hit full capacity within days. By March 11th, 2026, for the first time in its 45-year history, the East-West Pipeline reached its absolute maximum output, 7 million barrels per day. Tanker tracking firm Kapler reported a 330% surge in Yanbu loadings from pre-disruption levels. Windward Maritime AI counted 27 supertankers queued at anchorage off the Yanbu coast, the largest concentration of very large crude carriers ever recorded at a single Red Sea terminal. The $8.5 billion insurance policy, purchased 4 decades earlier, had just paid out. But here's the number that tells the real story. The Petroline can move 7 million barrels a day. The Strait of Hormuz normally carries 20 million. Even running absolutely flat out, Saudi Arabia's bypass covers barely a third of what's been lost. The world needed more. Much more. Saudi Arabia wasn't the only country thinking ahead. The United Arab Emirates built their own bypass route, different in design but identical in logic. The Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, known as ADCOP, runs 380 kilometers from Abu Dhabi's inland Habshan oil fields to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman. And Fujairah is the critical detail. It sits on the Indian Ocean side of the Arabian Peninsula, completely outside the Strait of Hormuz. Ships loading there never come within 200 kilometers of the choke point. Designed by Worley Parsons, built by China Petroleum Engineering and Construction Corporation, it came in over budget at $4.2 billion, $900 million above original estimates, and became operational in June 2012. Alongside the pipeline, ADNOC made one more critical decision. They carved 42 million barrels of underground storage into the bedrock at Fujairah, not above ground where it's exposed, underground, capable of sustaining exports for weeks even if the pipeline itself went offline. That is infrastructure foresight at the highest level. Today, ADCOP is running near full capacity, adding roughly 1.5 to 1.7 million barrels per day to the bypass effort. So add it up. Saudi Arabia's Petroline at 7 million barrels per day, UAE's ADCOP at 1.5 million. Together at maximum output, they can move somewhere between 4 and 5 million barrels per day to export terminals, against a Strait of Hormuz that normally carries 20 million. The IEA confirmed it bluntly. The gap between bypass capacity and normal Hormuz throughput is not a rounding error. It is a structural deficit, one that was always a deliberate choice by engineers and planners who assumed any disruption would be short. Days, maybe weeks, not months. Now here is where the infrastructure story becomes an economic emergency. Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar have no bypass pipelines. Zero. Their entire export architecture is built around Gulf shipping. When the strait closes, they have no alternative, no emergency exit, no decades-old insurance policy sitting in the desert. Qatar is perhaps the sharpest example of what this means. Qatar produces around 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas, the fuel that heats homes, powers electricity grids, and runs factories across Europe and Asia. All of it moves by tanker. All those tankers pass through Hormuz. When the strait closed, Qatar declared force majeure on its LNG contracts. The country that supplies a fifth of the world's gas suddenly had nowhere to send it. Building a bypass pipeline requires having friendly neighbors whose territory you can cross. Qatar is a peninsula. Bahrain is an island. Kuwait's options run through Iraq or Saudi Arabia, politically complex corridors, even in peacetime. But Iraq's situation is the most consequential for the bypass story unfolding right now, because Iraq is the country that is currently spending that $49 million every week. And the details of where every dollar is going reveal exactly how desperate, how complex, and how fascinating this infrastructure scramble really is. Iraq's numbers are staggering. Crude oil represents roughly 90% of the country's entire state revenue. Every civil servant's salary, every hospital, every infrastructure project, all of it funded by selling oil. Before the disruption, Iraq was exporting nearly 3.5 million barrels per day through Hormuz. Today, production has been slashed to around a third of normal, because storage tanks filled up and there was nowhere for the oil to go. So Iraq is pursuing bypass routes on 3 fronts simultaneously. And when you break down the costs of each, you get to $49 million per week. The first front, truck convoys. Iraq's oil ministry issued emergency tenders to export crude by road, tanker trucks, to the Mediterranean port of Banias in western Syria and the Jordanian Red Sea port of Aqaba. They're targeting around 200,000 barrels per day across both routes. Here's the economics. Shipping oil through the Gulf normally costs around 60 cents per barrel. Emergency truck transport across desert terrain through 3 countries runs $10 to $15 per barrel. That premium on 200,000 barrels a day costs approximately $16.8 million per week, just for the trucks. The second front, the Kirkuk-Ceyhan pipeline emergency rehabilitation. This 960-kilometer pipeline runs from northern Iraq's Kirkuk oil fields all the way to Turkey's Mediterranean port of Ceyhan. It's Iraq's largest crude oil export line, with a designed capacity of 1.6 million barrels per day. And it has been dormant since 2014, damaged and left idle. Iraq has now launched an emergency rehabilitation program, hydrostatic testing, inspection, repairs, across hundreds of kilometers of aging infrastructure. Iraq's oil minister confirmed on March 16th that final testing was underway, with an initial export target of 250,000 barrels per day. The pipeline has since restarted, though negotiations between Baghdad and the Kurdish regional government over access rights have complicated the ramp-up. The weekly cost of this emergency rehabilitation, approximately $14 million. The third front, 3 port activations at once: Ceyhan in Turkey, Aqaba in Jordan, Banias in Syria, all being activated or scaled up simultaneously. Emergency operational costs across 3 ports, handling new Iraqi crude flows, staffing up loading infrastructure, managing tanker logistics, approximately $9 million per week. And the fourth, engineering, diplomacy, and new pipeline planning. A Hong Kong-based investment firm called Heritage Funds LPF has submitted a proposal to Iraq's Ministry of Oil to finance 2 entirely new pipeline corridors, one from Basra to Aqaba, or Syria's Latakia port, and a second running directly from Basra to the Turkish border. Government engineering teams, international consultants, legal frameworks across 4 countries, diplomatic negotiations, approximately $4 million per week. Add it together, $16.8 million plus $14 million plus $9 million plus $4 million, and you land at approximately $44 million per week before operational variance. With contingency costs running at around 10% above planned estimates in emergency infrastructure programs, the working figure is $49 million per week. Every single week. And that number is just Iraq. Step back from the emergency operations and look at the biggest idea circulating in global energy infrastructure right now. The proposal that would, if built, permanently solve the Hormuz problem. A canal. A Saudi-backed engineering study proposed a 950-kilometer waterway linking the Arabian Gulf directly to the Arabian Sea. Not a pipeline. A navigable canal, 150 meters wide, 25 meters deep, capable of handling fully loaded supertankers. It would allow Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait to export oil and gas to global markets without their shipments ever approaching a single contested choke point. The economics make sense on paper. The geography does not. The proposed route crosses terrain with elevations of up to 700 meters above sea level. You cannot dig a canal through mountain ranges. The rock excavation alone would dwarf the construction of the Panama Canal. Estimated costs run into the hundreds of billions of dollars. Timelines stretch into decades. And even then, it would create a new narrow corridor, one that could be blocked by a stranded vessel, one that could face its own security vulnerabilities. The canal idea reveals something more fundamental. The global energy system was built around the assumption that the Strait of Hormuz would always be accessible. No bypass was ever built to fully replace it. The pipelines were sized for short disruptions. The canal was never built at all, and the countries most exposed were left with no exit. For 40 years, that was a bet most planners considered acceptable. Today, it isn't. Here is the part of this story that almost nobody is discussing. Every bypass route currently being used. Saudi Arabia's Petroline to Yanbu, the UAE's ADCOP to Fujairah, Iraq's truck convoys and rehabilitated pipelines to Aqaba and Ceyhan. They all eventually converge on one body of water, the Red Sea. And the Red Sea has its own southern exit point, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, barely 20 miles wide, connecting the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. It was the site of severe shipping disruptions as recently as 2024, when Red Sea instability forced major shipping lines to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks and thousands of dollars to every voyage. The engineering insight here is profound. And it's one the planners of the 1980s arguably didn't fully account for. You cannot solve a choke point problem by routing through a different choke point. Saudi Arabia spent $8.5 billion in today's money, building a pipeline that exits at a port that feeds into a different potential bottleneck. The UAE spent $4.2 billion on a pipeline to Fujairah, which also feeds into shipping lanes near contested waters. Iraq is spending $49 million a week routing oil to ports that all connect to the same Red Sea corridor. The bypass routes work. They are genuinely moving oil that would otherwise be completely stranded. but they have shifted the world's energy exposure from one narrow passage to another. Which raises the question that no infrastructure study, no pipeline proposal, and no government planning document has yet answered clearly. If the Red Sea becomes the next disrupted corridor, what is the backup for the backup? Here is what this infrastructure story ultimately proves. Saudi Arabia spent $8.5 billion on a pipeline it hoped never to use. And that pipeline became the backbone of global oil supply almost overnight. The UAE spent $4.2 billion on a port nobody talked about. And that port is now moving millions of barrels a day. Iraq spent nothing on a backup plan and is now paying $49 million every week for that decision, scrambling to build in months what should have taken decades. The lesson is not complicated. Infrastructure built for a crisis that hasn't arrived yet always looks like an overreaction, until the day it doesn't. Let us know what you think in the comments section. Speaking of routes nobody saw coming, our next video covers the one infrastructure project that could literally kill the Panama Canal. Click now, it's already up.